Now I thought for today's video we would get nice and nerdy. I want us just to really tap into that deep love of learning that we have as we explore the psalm titles. Now these are probably the things that we read over really quickly to get into the actual content of the psalms. And mainly that's because we have no idea what they mean, and we don't really think they mean anything for us, which is largely true. I want to read you a couple of these that just sort of prove the point here. Psalm chapter 4, the title says, "For the director of music with stringed instruments, a psalm of David." Psalm 5, for the director of music for pipes or for flutes or two pipes or two flutes, a psalm of David. Psalm 6, for the director of music with stringed instruments according to the Sheminith, which some English translations render on the eighth. Some people think that might mean that it's referring to an 8-stringed instrument. People don't really know what's going on, and then it concludes a psalm of David. Psalm chapter 8, for the director of music according to the Gittith. This is another musical term that nobody really knows what's going on. It could be an instrument, a melody. We don't quite have any understandings as to what this ancient word means, and then again it concludes a psalm of David. Now, my doctoral supervisor would say that this at least lets us know that the psalms were probably used in a musical setting, whether that's in a worship setting or what have you. And the terms that are used at the beginning of the psalms are something similar to time signatures or capo on the second fret, these sorts of instructions that are given to musicians in order for them to effectively play these tunes. Now, we don't know a lot of what's going on here. And I'm going to say that within the scholarly community, they also don't really think they know what's going on with regard to the authorship of the psalm. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of these psalms, 73 in the Hebrew Bible, there's actually, I believe, 85 in the Greek translation, that attribute the psalms to David. In Hebrew, the phrase is Mizmor LaDavid. It means a psalm. And then it gets tricky. Le David is a prepositional phrase. Le being the preposition, it can mean to, it can mean for, it could mean about, and then it's attached to the proper name, David. So it could technically be a psalm written to David, or a psalm about David, a psalm that's belonging to David, a psalm that's concerning David or for David, or yes, it could also mean that it's a psalm that is written by David. One scholar, however, kind of summarizes the field when he says, a wide consensus has been reached among critical scholars for over 100 years. And this book was actually written almost 50 years ago. This is from Reverend Child's intro to the Old Testament as Christian scripture. He says, a wide consensus has been reached among critical scholars for over 100 years that the titles, the things that we were just looking at, they're secondary additions which can afford no reliable information toward establishing the genuine historical setting of the Psalms. Now, that doesn't mean that David did not write the Psalms, but it does mean that we are a bit unsure about who wrote the Psalms, and maybe these were just written about or concerning or for David, or even beyond that, for the king of Israel, or for potentially future Messiah who takes on the name of David. There's also 13 chapters in the book of Psalms that have what is called a long title or an extended introduction, like in a couple videos ago when we were looking at Psalm chapter 3. It reads, a psalm of David, Mizmor LaDavid, when he fled from his son Absalom. A psalm of David when he was fleeing from Absalom. This story is retold in 2 Samuel 15 through 17 or so, maybe up to 18, I forget. But when you compare that story in 2 Samuel, where David is fleeing from his son who is attempting to usurp his own power and take over the throne, and you compare that to the psalm really doesn't have a lot in common with that. Major themes, yes, of course, but it doesn't really seem to describe the state of mind that David is in the narrative in 2 Samuel. So what scholars have said is that this is a piece of inner biblical exegesis, or in Jewish terms, this would be midrash. These are later readers of the Bible who are looking at these Psalms and saying, hey, when it says, how many are my foes and many are rising against me, that kind of sounds like David when he was running away from Absalom. And they begin to create a title that tells the reader to read the psalm in that framework, in light of that story. And where it gets a little bit interesting for us, I understand this is like nerdy material, but where it gets a little bit interesting for us is the editors seem to be providing people with a way into the psalm, but also inviting people to make connections between the psalms and their own stories. To say, hey, this is like an episode in David's life, and maybe it's like an episode in your life too. And for us, centuries later, we still come back to these psalms and we still put ourselves in the place of the unknown I in the psalm, the one who is singing and praying and lamenting and giving thanksgiving and praise to God. It's still possible for us to enter into the stories of these psalms, whether or not these are actually written by David, or whether or not these psalms were written by David in response to a certain historical event in his life. Hopefully we can move beyond those questions to questions of, well, how can I pray this prayer, and how can I then see myself through the lens that the psalm is providing? My hope is that as we explore the Psalms further, we can dig into some of the historical questions and the nerdy stuff, yes, but also we can place ourselves within the words of the Psalms, take them as our own, and pray them back to God together.